The usher looked straight at me, then past me, and said, "That seat is reserved for family." I was standing in the front row at my mother's funeral, still wearing the black wool coat I had thrown over the dress I'd slept in for 3 hours, holding the folded program with my own last name printed under beloved daughter, and my Aunt Lenora did not even lower her voice when she answered for him. "Not her," she said, touching my elbow as if she were correcting a caterer. "That seat is for Celeste." My cousin Celeste was already sitting where I was supposed to be, one gloved hand resting on the white rose arrangement beside my mother's casket, her posture composed, her chin lowered in a performance of grief so polished. It made several people in the second row turn to look at me as though I had arrived late to my own life. I saw the recognition on a few faces from church, from my mother's bridge group, from the neighborhood where I had spent the last 8 months driving back and forth before dawn to manage medications, meals, bills, and the kind of appointments that slowly turn a daughter into a private system nobody thanks because they assume systems simply run. For one full second, nobody spoke. The organist kept playing. A woman near the aisle adjusted her purse and looked down. My mother's former pastor, who had come to lead the service, glanced at the front row, and then at me with the careful stillness people use when they realize something improper is happening in public, and do not yet know who has the authority to stop it. I did not argue. That was what Aunt Lenora was waiting for. It was in the way she squared her shoulders, ready to frame me as difficult inside a room built for mourning. My Uncle Percy stood 2 feet behind her, not meeting my eyes. My younger half-brother, Trent, kept his hand on the end of the pew and stared at the carpet as if silence could make him innocent. So I asked the usher calmly, "Who changed the seating list?" His face shifted before he answered. "That was the first useful thing I saw that morning. I just placed people according to the entry sheet we were given," he said. Lenora stepped in too quickly. "Naomi, please. This is not the time." That sentence is always used by the person benefiting from the timing. I looked at Celeste then. She gave me a small, sorrowful smile that belonged on television and moved her handbag onto the space beside her, claiming more of the row with one neat gesture. She was not grieving my mother. She was occupying a position. There is a difference. And once you learn to see it, you cannot unsee it. The front pew had 6 reserved places. My mother's casket centered the room. On the left sat Celeste in my place. Then Trent. Then Aunt Lenora. On the right was one empty chair, my mother's framed photograph on an easel, and then 2 seats filled by men from the funeral home. The arrangement itself told a story. Niece, son, sister, daughter displaced so smoothly it could be mistaken for administrative error. But administrative errors do not usually come with matching expressions. I stepped aside before anyone could touch me again, and took a seat on the aisle of the second row. Behind me, whispers rose and softened. In front of me, I watched Lenora exhale with the relief of someone whose first move had landed. That told me this had been discussed in advance. People improvising cruelty look unstable. People enacting a plan tend to relax after the first public success. The service began. Pastor Rollins spoke warmly about my mother's discipline, her garden, her stubborn kindness, the way she never let a phone call go unanswered if she thought someone might be lonely. I kept my face still and listened for what he did not say. He had met with the family 2 nights earlier to prepare his remarks. I had not been invited to that meeting. Trent had texted me the time, after it was already over, saying things had moved fast, which was the same phrase he used when my mother's silver was boxed without me, and when the locks at her house were temporarily changed for security. Then Celeste stood to read the scripture. For a moment I thought I had misheard her name. My mother had chosen that reading with me in hospice 3 weeks earlier, when her hands were already thin and cool, and she still wanted to discuss whether the blue sweater in her closet should go to donation or to the church drive because good wool shouldn't be wasted. She had asked me to read at the funeral because, in her words, your voice holds steady when other people's don't. We had gone over the passage twice. I knew where she wanted me to pause. Celeste read it badly. Not theatrically badly. Just enough to prove she had never practiced it with my mother. Had never sat by her bed. had never listened to the way she liked certain words given room. She rushed the line about love bearing all things. She swallowed the final sentence and sat down before the echo settled. A few older women in the third row frowned, not because they knew the family politics, but because they knew my mother, and they knew when something around her had been done without care. That is the thing about betrayal at funerals. People think grief hides it. Often grief sharpens it. When the eulogy portion began, Trent walked to the lectern with a folded page. He was wearing the charcoal suit I had bought for him 2 years earlier when he could not afford one for a job interview. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked Aunt Lenora for guiding the family through difficult decisions. He thanked Celeste for stepping in everywhere it counted. Then he said, "My mother was held up in her final months by the people who truly showed up." Several heads turned, not toward him, but toward me. There are insults that land because they are loud, and there are insults that land because they are arranged to sound respectable. That line had been polished for witnesses. It was designed to stain without appearing vulgar. If I reacted, I would become the woman disrupting her mother's funeral. If I stayed silent, the sentence would sit in the room as fact. So I took out my phone and lowered the brightness. Not to text anyone. Not yet. I opened the folder I had built during my mother's decline because illness produces paperwork the way storms produce debris. Hospice schedules, medication logs, insurance authorizations, grocery deliveries, home health invoices, after-hours call records, the calendar entries showing which nights I slept in the vinyl chair beside her recliner because her breathing sounded wrong and she was too proud to say she was afraid. I did not need to read any of it. I needed only the reminder that systems keep their own memory, even when families decide to invent a cleaner version. From the pulpit, Trent continued. He spoke about sacrifice with the vagueness of a man borrowing language from people who had actually made one. He said family had come together beautifully at the end. Lenora dabbed at dry eyes. Celeste lowered her head again at exactly the right angle. My Uncle Percy kept folding and unfolding the edge of his program until the paper softened in his hands. Then Pastor Rollins invited the immediate family to stand beside the casket for the closing prayer. Lenora rose first. Trent followed. Celeste stood with them before the pastor even finished the sentence. He looked toward the first row, then toward me in the second. He hesitated. That hesitation was small. Most people probably missed it. I did not. Immediate family. The phrase hung there while my mother's sister, my cousin, and my half-brother formed a tidy line near the casket, leaving no visual space for me unless I chose to walk forward and force one open with my body. Lenora kept her face arranged in solemn patience, but I could see the alertness under it. She knew exactly what this moment looked like from the pews. She was counting on the room to accept the image before anyone had time to question how it had been built. I stood anyway, but not to join them. I stepped into the side aisle and walked toward the vestibule where the funeral director's assistant was holding a clipboard against her black dress. She had checked people in as they arrived. She was efficient, discreet, and old enough to have spent a career noticing family wars people tried to hide behind floral arrangements. "May I see the entry list for immediate family?" I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered toward the front of the chapel, then back to me. She understood two things at once: that I was not guessing, and that whatever had just happened up front had not happened by accident. "I can't hand it over during the service," she said. "You don't need to hand it over," I said. "Just tell me whether my name is on it." She looked down at the page. Her mouth tightened almost invisibly. "Yes," she said. "You're listed as next of kin." Inside the chapel, Pastor Rollins was beginning the closing prayer over a picture they had already started arranging without me. I thanked the assistant, returned to my seat, and bowed my head at the exact moment everyone else did. That was the first moment I knew two things could be true at once. They had planned to erase me in public, and the structure beneath them had not agreed. When the prayer ended, the chapel loosened into movement. Coats were lifted from pew backs. Programs folded shut. People began turning toward one another with that careful funeral softness that looks like kindness from a distance and, up close, often becomes surveillance. Everyone wanted to know what they had just witnessed without being the one rude enough to ask. I stayed in the second row a few seconds longer, and let Aunt Lenora believe the humiliation had settled where she wanted it. She glanced back once on her way into the aisle. Not openly, just enough to confirm I was still behind her. Celeste was already receiving condolences near the casket, standing where a daughter should have stood, accepting them with lowered eyes and measured nods. Trent had moved beside two men from church, wearing the expression of a son trying to look burdened rather than complicit. The arrangement was too smooth to be accidental. They were not only grieving my mother, they were presenting a replacement order. That was the real purpose of the seat. A funeral is one of the few rooms where family hierarchy can be rewritten in silence. Put one woman in the front row, another behind it, and people begin adjusting their understanding before a single fact is spoken. Whoever is seen closest to the casket is assumed to have been closest to the life. That assumption travels quickly. It follows the burial, the condolences, the estate conversation, the sale of a house, the handling of jewelry, the final story people tell about who mattered. I stood and stepped into the aisle just as Mrs. Halpern caught my wrist. She was my mother's neighbor, small and sharp-eyed, with the kind of memory that made careless people nervous. "I looked for you up front," she said. I noticed. Her gaze moved briefly toward Lenora and back to me. "Your mother kept your name on everything that mattered." It was not comfort. It was information. I thanked her and moved on. Pastor Rollins reached me before I made it to the vestibule. He looked more troubled now than he had from the pulpit. "Your mother asked for you to read," he said quietly. "That was what I had written down." "I know." He took that in with visible regret. "I was told there had been a change." "By whom?" He hesitated. That answer told me enough. No one with actual authority had made a clean request he could stand behind. Someone had simply filled the silence first and relied on the room to accept it. Near the doors, the funeral director's assistant was still stationed beside the register table, composed and unreadable in black. I signed my name under a column of relatives and church friends, then looked up. "You said I'm still listed as next of kin," I said softly. "Yes. And the file?" She held my gaze for one careful second. "The file remains under the original authorization." That word mattered more than sympathy. Authorization. Not memory. Not family preference. Not who stood closest to the flowers. Structure. "Was a change requested?" I asked. Her professionalism closed over her face again. "I can't discuss internal communications." She did not need to. If the change had been lawful, she would have said so. Outside, the winter air cut clean through woolen perfume. The hearse was waiting at the curb, and the staff had begun guiding people toward the steps for the transition to the cemetery. That was when I saw Lenora hand a cream envelope to the funeral director. She did it neatly, with the ease of someone continuing a private arrangement. He glanced at it and slipped it beneath his folder without opening it. Not grief. Process. Trent was already guiding Celeste toward the front for the family photograph. I could see the next image forming before anyone called for it. Lenora at one side, Trent at the other. Celeste close to the casket, and me placed where absence could later be explained as temperament. These things are never just pictures. They become captions in other people's minds. She wasn't really involved. The others handled everything. You could tell who the real family was. "Naomi," Lenora called when she saw me coming. Her voice had softened into public sweetness. "There you are. Come stand over here." She pointed, not to the center, but near the end of the line. Not beside my mother. Not where a daughter belonged. Somewhere useful, manageable, and easily cropped. I stopped a few feet short of them and looked at the funeral director instead. "Before the casket is moved," I said, loud enough for the nearest relatives to hear, "I want confirmation that the release instructions on file are still under the original next of kin authorization." The cold seemed to sharpen around us. The photographer lowered his camera. Mrs. Halpern, 2 steps behind me now, went completely still. Even people who did not understand the details understood the tone. The conversation had moved out of sentiment and into control. Trent turned toward me too quickly. "Naomi, not now." That was the second time that day someone benefiting from the arrangement had tried to use timing as a weapon. I did not look at him. "I'm not making a speech," I said. I'm asking a procedural question. Lenora gave a small breath of disbelief, as if I were embarrassing myself instead of interrupting her script. This is your mother's funeral. Yes, I said. Which is why I'd like to know why the person listed as next of kin was removed from the front row and replaced before burial. No one moved after that. The funeral director adjusted the folder in his hands. He chose his words carefully, but he answered in the only way that mattered. The transport and burial release remain under the original authorization. No transfer of authority has been executed. Celeste stepped back a fraction. Trent looked at Lenora. And Lenora, for the first time that morning, lost control of her expression before she found it again. It lasted less than a second. Long enough. The funeral director's answer did not create a scene. It created something more dangerous. A silence fell that had edges. People who had been politely looking away a moment earlier were now looking directly at Lenora, then at me, then back at the folder in the funeral director's hands, as though paperwork had suddenly become more trustworthy than blood. The photographer did not lift his camera again. Celeste's posture changed first. Not dramatically. She simply removed her hand from the side handle of the casket and let it fall to her coat seam, as if she had realized too late that she had been standing inside a role that now had structure attached to it, and structure was not on her side. Lenora recovered quickly, but not cleanly. No one transferred anything, she said. You are twisting ordinary funeral arrangements into some legal spectacle because you're emotional. That was her first direct move of the day. Not denial, but reframing. Make me unstable, and the displacement becomes compassionate management rather than organized removal. I kept my eyes on the funeral director. Who submitted the seating and reading changes? He did not answer right away. He had spent enough years around bereaved families to know when one wrong sentence could make him part of the problem. The ceremonial details were adjusted through family communication, he said carefully. Those details are separate from release authorization. Separate. That word mattered because it revealed method. They had not touched what required legal standing. They had only altered what the room could see, which meant this was not confusion. It was strategy. Lenora heard it too, because she stepped in before anyone else could speak. I handled logistics, she said. Someone had to. Your mother's final week was chaotic, and you were not in a position to make every decision objectively. There are accusations designed to wound, and accusations designed to build a later file. That sentence belonged to the second category. Not you were absent. Not you didn't care. Something colder. You were too emotionally compromised. If repeated often enough, it could be used to justify why others had stepped in. I turned to her at last. Then explain why Pastor Rollins was told there had been a change my mother never made. Trent took one step forward. Naomi, enough. His voice was low, but the strain in it was new. He was not trying to calm me. He was trying to contain the moment before it became evidence in other people's memories. Pastor Rollins, to his credit, did not retreat. He looked between us, then said, I was informed the scripture reading had been reassigned because the family agreed it would be better handled differently. Which family? I asked. No one answered. That was the third useful thing I saw that day. Not a document, not a file, but the coordinated instinct to let silence protect the same lie. Mrs. Halpern shifted her cane slightly on the stone and said, in the plain voice of an elderly woman who had outlived her fear of impoliteness, her mother told everyone Naomi was handling things. Ho! Nobody rebuked her. They could not. She had known my mother for 27 years and had the kind of local credibility Lenora could not outperform with polished grief. Lenora smiled the way people do when they are already deciding whom to punish later. No one is disputing that Naomi helped. Helped. 8 months of medication logs, insurance fights, overnight monitoring, freezer meals, laundry, pharmacy pickups, oxygen deliveries, bill sorting, and hospice coordination reduced to a volunteer verb. I felt the force of it. But I did not spend words on my feelings. Feelings were what Lenora wanted in the air. Facts were worse for her. My mother selected the reading with me in hospice, I said. She asked me to deliver it. She also designated me as next of kin on the funeral file. So either the changes were random, which they weren't, or someone deliberately separated ceremonial control from legal authority. The funeral director looked down, then back up. He did not confirm it, but he did not challenge it either. And in that refusal to contradict me, several people heard the truth. We moved to the cemetery in a slower, fractured procession after that. Whatever clean image Lenora had wanted from the chapel no longer held. Conversations broke into smaller clusters. Celeste rode with Aunt Lenora instead of remaining near the hearse. Trent drove alone. I followed behind with Mrs. Halpern in my passenger seat because her nephew had gone ahead to prepare a path over the damp ground. For the first 10 minutes, she said nothing. She folded her gloves in her lap and looked out at the low gray trees passing beside the road. Then she asked, "Did your mother ever sign anything new?" "No." "You're certain?" "Yes." She nodded once. Then this started before today. I had already begun to know that. Hearing someone else say it made it harder to pretend the damage was limited to a seat and a reading. At the cemetery, the wind flattened every voice. Chairs had been set up on the grass for older guests. The burial tent snapped lightly at the corners. Men from the funeral home positioned the casket over the lowering device with practiced discretion, and I watched the folder never leave the director's side. Lenora approached me there, finally abandoning sweetness. "You should stop this now," she said under her breath. "People are already upset." "About what?" "About your behavior." "No," I said. "They're upset because they understood it." Her eyes sharpened. "Do not make your grief into a claim." That line would have sounded elegant to anyone overhearing only half of it. But what I heard underneath was clearer. She was already trying to separate me from anything that could be called a right. Grief, in her version, was excess. Claim was the danger. "I'm not making a claim," I said. "I'm noticing one." She stared at me for a moment, then gave a short breath through her nose. "Your mother was tired at the end. She said different things to different people." There it was. The first attempt to weaken the dead woman herself. Not enough yet to call her incompetent outright. Just enough to muddy intent. A moral line had been crossed in the chapel. Here at the grave, Lenora crossed another one. She used my mother's decline as a tool against her own choices. I held her gaze and said, "Be careful with that sentence." For the first time, she looked away first. The burial was short. Cold has a way of editing grief. Pastor Rollins spoke again. Soil waited in neat dark piles. Someone handed out single white carnations. When it was my turn to step forward, I placed mine on the casket and looked at the brass nameplate. At the dates marking a whole life in 2 clean lines. And for 1 human second, nothing legal, strategic, or procedural existed at all. Only the fact that my mother was gone, and that the last public thing done around her had been an attempt to move me out of the frame. When I stepped back, a young woman in a navy coat approached me hesitantly. I recognized her after a moment as Kendra, one of the hospice nurses who had come on Tuesdays and sometimes Fridays when scheduling allowed. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but your mother always referred decisions to you. We were instructed to call you first." I turned fully toward her. "Instructed by whom?" "By her," Kendra said, "and later by the intake file." Intake file. Another structure. Another system. Another place where my mother's intentions had been recorded by people outside the family story Lenora was trying to build. Kendra glanced toward the grave, then back at me. "There was some confusion last week when someone called asking for medication disposal guidance and claimed to be managing final arrangements. Our office wouldn't release anything because the authorization contact on record wasn't changed." "Who called?" She hesitated, uncomfortable now that she realized what she was adding to the day. "I don't know the name. I only heard about it in handoff." That was enough. Not proof for a courtroom. Not yet. But proof of shape. Someone had already been testing the perimeter calling systems, trying doors, seeing what would open without formal authority. The funeral rearrangement had not been an isolated cruelty. It fit a pattern. I thanked her. She squeezed my hand once and went back toward the other mourners. By the time the last prayer ended, I had 3 separate structures that still pointed to me. The funeral file. the hospice intake, and Pastor Rollins's original notes. 3 different places. 3 different witnesses. One consistent truth. They had tried to replace me in public without replacing me on paper, which meant they knew exactly what they were doing. After the burial, everyone moved toward warmth. Some followed the church volunteers to the fellowship hall for coffee and casseroles. Some went home. I drove straight to my mother's house, because by then I understood something clearly. What happened at the funeral was not just humiliation. It was staging. And staged things usually point to something practical behind them. Money, access, paperwork, control. The front lock no longer took my key. I stood on the porch with my hand still on the knob and let that fact settle before I gave it emotion. The lock had been changed between the nights I slept there and the afternoon we buried my mother. That meant someone had not only moved me out of the front row, someone had moved me out of the house. I did not call anyone. I walked to the side entrance, entered through the old garage code my mother never bothered changing, and stepped into a silence that had already been handled by other hands. The mudroom alarm gave a warning tone instead of the usual chime. Someone had altered the settings. In the kitchen, the dishwasher was empty and open. The hospice supplies stacked by the pantry were gone. 2 framed photos had been removed from the den mantel, leaving clean outlines in the dust. On the table sat sympathy cards already separated from their envelopes. Somebody had been sorting the house before the ground over my mother had settled. I went straight to the study. My mother kept her real life there: insurance folders, tax statements, utility records, legal correspondence. Every document that mattered once feelings stopped mattering. The household binder was gone from the second drawer on the left. So was the small ceramic jar where she kept spare checks. Whoever had come in knew exactly which things controlled a house. But the fireproof box under the desk was still there. I opened it with the combination my mother made me memorize every spring. Inside were the current deed, the prior deed, her funeral pre-need agreement, her healthcare directive, and a folder labeled in her handwriting. House, title, Helen. I sat on the rug and opened it. The deed had not changed. The house was still solely in her name. No transfer. No added co-owner. No emergency quitclaim. The tax statement matched. So did the insurance file. Under those papers was a letter from an estate attorney named Roderick Sloan, dated 11 months earlier. It confirmed that my mother had requested a review of her estate documents because of concerns about future pressure from relatives after decline in health. The letter also made one point unmistakably clear. No revisions would be made without her in-person confirmation and independent capacity review. I read that line twice. They had not failed to move the structure because they were respectful. They had failed because the structure would not move for them. Then I opened the sealed envelope with my name on it. Naomi, if you are reading this after I am gone, do not let people rush you with family understanding. Anything that matters is written, filed, or paid. If anyone starts rearranging things before the ground settles, begin with the house, the funeral agreement, and Mr. Sloan. You are not imagining the pattern. Love. Mom. I put the note down very carefully. That was the reveal. Not a dramatic hidden fortune. Something stronger. My mother had seen this coming. She had understood that once illness weakened her, certain relatives would try to replace care with access and emotion with pressure. So she had done what she always did when something mattered. She put it in a file, attached a name to it, and made the structure harder to bend. The house was not just property. It was the place she had kept after the divorce. Paid off early, repaired room by room, and defended with years of disciplined work. If they took control of it, they would not just gain an asset. They would rewrite who had held this family up. My phone rang. Trent. I answered on the third ring. Where are you? He asked. At Mom's. A pause. Then, you shouldn't be there alone. Why? We were going to go through things together. Vey. Not I was worried about you. Not I didn't want you by yourself in that house today. Go through things. That was the real agenda. Stripped of performance. Aunt Lenore's with me, he added. Percy too. Celeste's here. Of course she was. I'm in the study, I said. His voice changed, only slightly. Don't start opening files. That told me more than any confession would have. I'm looking at Mom's documents, I said. Lenora says you're making this harder than it needs to be. She changed the locks before the burial. Silence. Then he said, that was for security. From whom? He did not answer. In the background, I heard chairs scraping, and Lenora speaking low, too close to his phone for it to be accidental. They were together, deciding in real time how much to admit and how much to delay. Just wait until we get there, he said. No, I answered. After I hung up, I photographed everything exactly as I found it. The deed, the attorney's letter, the funeral agreement, my mother's note. Then I called the number on Roderick Sloane's letterhead. The main line rolled to an after-hours service for estate administration. A woman answered on the second ring. I gave my mother's name and said, I believe relatives are trying to control funeral decisions and house access without title authority. I found prior correspondence from Mr. Sloane about pressure after health decline. Her response was immediate and practical. Do you have the original documents? Yes. Do not leave them in the house. Do not surrender copies, keys, or authority based on verbal family agreement. Mr. Sloane can see you tomorrow at 9. Tomorrow at 9. For the first time that day, the structure answered back. I moved through the house one room at a time after that, no longer looking for grief but for pattern. The extra keys were gone from the kitchen drawer. The property tax folder had been disturbed. In the bedroom closet, several coats were missing. But the jewelry case remained untouched, either because they had not gotten that far, or because they did not yet know what had real value. They were not taking memories. They were searching for leverage. I read the funeral pre-need agreement in full. My mother had prepaid most of the service 2 years earlier. The document named me as authorized representative for final arrangements if she became unable to manage details herself. Trent was listed only as a secondary contact for notifications. Notifications only. That explained the careful language from the funeral director outside the chapel. They had been bold enough to change the image, but not bold enough to change the file. By the time headlights crossed the front curtains, I had packed the original documents into the fireproof box, moved the box into my trunk, and left only scanned copies in a plain folder on the study desk. Then the front handle rattled. Lenora's voice came through the door first. Naomi, why is the chain on? I had latched it from the inside after entering through the garage. My mother used to say, a locked door is not hostility. It is clarity. I walked into the foyer but did not open it. Because I'm inside, I said. Open the door. In a moment. Her tone flattened. This is not your house. I looked at the copied papers on the hall table and thought of the original deed in my car. No, I said. It's hers. That's the problem, isn't it? Lenora did not answer me right away. Through the front door, there was only the faint sound of wind moving across the porch and the small silence people make when they have just heard the truth said too plainly. Then she changed tactics. Naomi, she said, softer now, almost patient, as if this were a family misunderstanding instead of a seizure attempt staged between burial and supper. Open the door. We are all tired. No one is here to fight. That was the first lie of the evening. I unlatched the chain and opened the door. Lenora stepped in first, eyes moving past me toward the study before she even looked at my face. Trent came behind her, tense and pale under the porch light. Percy hovered near the threshold. Celeste stayed closer to the steps, as though distance might help her later if she needed to claim she had not really been involved. No one offered comfort. No one looked around the house with grief. Their attention went exactly where I expected it to go. The desk, the hallway table, the rooms where papers might still be. You moved things? Trent asked. I secured original documents. His expression sharpened immediately. You had no right to remove anything. Not what did you find? Not what did Mom want. Only control. Only possession. Only fear that something had moved beyond his reach. I picked up the plain folder of copies from the study desk and handed it to him. He opened it standing there in the foyer. The deed came first. Then the attorney's letter. Then the funeral agreement. By the time he reached the second page, his whole face had tightened. Lenora took the folder from him too quickly. She read faster than he did. That told me what kind of help she had really been providing all along. No revisions without in-person confirmation and independent capacity review, I said, while she stared at the attorney's letter. Looks like Mom was expecting pressure. Lenora lifted her eyes slowly. Your mother was frightened near the end. People put ideas in her head. That was the moment the shape of it became final. They had not just humiliated me after her death. They had been working on her while she was alive, weak, medicated, and easier to corner. They had tried to create a path around her judgment before they ever tried to create a path around mine. You approached her, I said. No one approached her, Lenora said too fast. Then why was she already with an estate attorney 11 months ago? Because she was worried about pressure from relatives after health decline. Percy looked down. Trent said nothing. Celeste stayed very still. Silence can be cleaner than confession. I did not need them to admit everything. I only needed to watch who could not deny it. Lenora set the folder down on the hall table. Your mother asked for help. She said the house was becoming too much. She said things needed to be simplified. The language was practiced. Not grief language. Persuasion language. Too much. Simplified. Help. All the careful words people use when they want a vulnerable person to surrender control while still feeling reasonable. She asked me to manage her bills, I said. I did. She didn't want you trapped here forever. No, I said. She didn't want you near the title. That landed. Celeste made the smallest sound and looked away. At the funeral, she had been willing to sit in my place, read my passage, and stand where a daughter stood because someone had made it seem safe. Now, inside the house itself, with documents on the table and the dead woman's intent laid out in black ink, even she no longer knew how to wear the role cleanly. I looked at her. You knew. Her head lifted fast. I knew Aunt Lenora was helping. With what? She hesitated. With arrangements. Before Mom died? The question settled over the room and changed it. Not after death. Before. Not grief management. Preparation. Celeste answered carefully, and that carefulness told the truth before her words did. There were conversations, Trent muttered. This is getting ridiculous. But he did not say I was wrong. He did not say no such conversations happened. He objected only to hearing them named out loud. I rested one hand on the back of a dining chair and felt the smooth wood my mother polished every holiday, whether company deserved it or not. How long? I asked. Lenora held my gaze. Then, because some people think a partial confession gives them back control, she said. Your mother knew practical decisions had to be made. She was worried you were too emotionally attached to every object, every room, every routine. That was the ugliest lie of all. While they were building that version of me, I had been emptying bedside commodes, checking oxygen tubing, arguing with insurance reps, sleeping in half clothes on the den sofa, and learning which nights her pain rose before she admitted it. They had been preparing to call me unfit because I cared too much, while I was still doing the work that allowed them the freedom to prepare it. I saw the whole structure then. Lenora had not suddenly become bold after my mother died. She had been laying ground for months. Trent would be framed as the son who needed support. Celeste would be presented as a helpful younger woman who could step in gracefully. And I would be recast as the daughter too emotional, too entangled, too controlling to be trusted with objective decisions. Once that story was accepted, every later move became easier. The front row replacement, the changed reading, the altered locks, the missing binder, the pressure around the house. They had not simply betrayed me at the funeral. They had built the betrayal while I was still making sure my mother had ice water by the bed. Trent tried to reclaim ground the way weaker people often do when paperwork turns against them. He moved from authority to resentment. You made Mom depend on you, he said. You were in every appointment, every account, every decision. There was never room for anyone else. I looked at him for a long second. He either believed that, or needed to believe it badly enough to say it aloud. Either way, it explained too much. She depended on the person who showed up, I said. His face reddened. That's not fair. No, it was not fair. Not the months before. Not the funeral. Not the locks. Not the effort to turn care into evidence against me. Lenora cut in before he lost more ground. We are talking about what is sustainable. This house cannot stay in limbo. There are taxes, maintenance, liabilities. Your mother understood that. She prepaid the funeral. She kept the house current. She retained counsel. She left instructions, I said. She understood structure better than all of us. Lenora's mouth hardened. And structure will show this estate needs orderly management. It was the first time she had said estate in that house. Not memory. Not mourning. Estate. That was the deeper moral reveal. They were not reacting to loss. They had been waiting beneath it, waiting for the moment when the care work ended. The body was gone, and they could move fast enough to turn exhaustion into leverage. They had used my mother's decline as a runway for control. I put on my coat and said, I have an appointment with Mr. Sloane at 9 tomorrow. The change in Lenora's face was immediate and small but real. Fear always arrives first in the eyes. You called him? Yes. That is unnecessary. No, I said. Changing the locks before burial was unnecessary. She had no answer to that. I opened the door. Percy left first, relieved to escape the room without taking a position he might later have to defend. Celeste followed without meeting my eyes. Trent stayed 1 second longer, still standing inside the house like a man hoping the structure might yet bend back toward him. This doesn't have to become a war, he said. It already did, I answered. You just wanted me unarmed. He looked at me, then at the folder on the hall table, and walked out. Lenora remained on the porch until the others had reached the driveway. Then she turned once and said, Think carefully about what you do next. I looked past her at my mother's dark winter beds, the porch light still burning, the house she had kept standing on discipline, caution, and earned money. I am, I said. Then I closed the door. For the first time since she died, the house no longer felt empty. It felt defended. At 8:43 the next morning, Lenora escalated. I was walking into Roderick Sloane's office when Adult Protective Services called. A woman named Dana Mercer said they had received a concern about my mother's end-of-life care and possible unauthorized removal of documents from the house. It was fast enough to tell me this had been deliberate. Lenora had moved from funeral optics to system pressure in less than a day. She was trying to stain me through procedure before I could reach formal structure first. I told Dana the truth plainly. My mother had died 3 days earlier. I had been her primary caregiver. She had retained estate counsel before her death because she feared pressure from relatives after her health declined. I was standing outside that attorney's office with the original deed, funeral authorization, and her written instructions. Dana asked a few direct questions. Were the locks changed? Yes. Before burial? Yes. Was there an active dispute over house access and estate records? Yes. Her tone changed after that. She said it sounded less like a protective services emergency and more like a family authority dispute. She told me to preserve records and communicate through counsel. They had tried to get ahead of me before business hours. That told me they were afraid now. Inside, mister. Sloane listened without interrupting while I laid out the deed, the funeral agreement, my mother's note, the prior letter from his office, and my summary of what happened at the funeral in the house. When I finished, he opened his own file and said, Your mother was worried about this. He showed me a signed memo from 6 months earlier. It instructed that if disputes arose after her death, all communication about house access, document control, and possible liquidation should go through his office because certain relatives might try to create urgency where none legally existed. My mother had seen the method before I did. Not just pressure. Strategy. Mr. Sloane moved quickly after that. By mid-morning, formal notice had gone out to Lenora, Trent, and Percy. No one was to enter the house, remove records, sell property, or make estate-related decisions without review through counsel. He also sent preservation notices to the funeral home and church regarding any communications about seating changes, readings, and family authorization. He was not treating the funeral as a motion. He was treating it as sequence. At 12:14, Trent called. "What the hell is this?" he asked. "It's counsel," I said. "You sent legal notice to the funeral home?" "No." "Mr. Sloan did. You're making us look insane." "No," I said. "Changing the locks before burial did that." He went quiet, then said people were calling. Pastor Rollins, Mrs. Halpern, women from church. They had heard there were formal instructions from my mother. That was the shift. The minute letterhead entered the story, their private version started collapsing in public. Pastor Rollins called not long after. He asked me 2 questions only. Had my mother asked me to read? Yes. Was I the authorized family representative on the funeral file? Yes. He said, "Then I will not repeat any version that suggests otherwise." The funeral director called next. His voice was careful now. "For the record," he said, "burial and release authority were never reassigned. The ceremonial requests came through your aunt. That was what Lenora had been relying on all along. Public image without legal standing." By late afternoon, Celeste came to the house. She looked nervous before she even spoke. Then she told me Lenora had said the front row placement was already decided, that I was too deep in grief to represent the family properly, and that Trent needed someone steadier beside him. I asked one question that mattered. Was she planning this before Mom died? Celeste hesitated too long. Then she said Lenora had come to the house twice the week before my mother died. Once with Trent, once alone. After one of those visits, Trent had a file box in his trunk, and Lenora had said, "If Helen won't sign now, we'll deal with it after." That was the real escalation, not just the funeral, not just the locks. They had been preparing for my mother's death while I was still caring for her. When Celeste left, the house felt quieter than it had the night before, but not weaker. They had escalated through systems, reputation, and pressure. Now the systems were beginning to answer back. The collapse happened 2 days later in the church fellowship hall. Lenora had insisted on hosting the post-service lunch herself. By then I understood why. She wanted one more room under her control. One more gathering where she could smooth over the funeral, keep Trent centered, keep herself respectable, and leave me looking like the daughter who had brought lawyers into grief. The room was full when I arrived. Coffee urns, casseroles, folding chairs, quiet church voices. My mother's photo stood near the front beside a table of flowers. Pastor Rollins was there. So were 2 deacons, Mrs. Halpern, Percy, Trent, Celeste, and enough relatives for a version of the story to spread cleanly if no one stopped it. Lenora saw me and smiled with public grace. "Naomi," she said, "I'm glad you came. This is my mother's church," I answered. She kept her smile and turned back to the room. "We were just thanking everyone who helped us through the last months. It's important, after confusion, to bring peace back into a family." Confusion. That was still her strategy. Shrink documented manipulation into misunderstanding. Make deliberate acts sound like emotional mess. Then she lifted a page from the table and made the mistake that ended her. "I know lawyers have now become involved," she said, glancing at me as if I were the one embarrassing the dead. "That's unfortunate. Some of us were only trying to protect Helen's intentions before things became distorted." I did not step toward her. I took a certified copy from my bag and handed it to Pastor Rollins. "Please read the first line," I said. The room shifted before he even opened it. He read silently first, then aloud. "Certain relatives may attempt to create urgency where none legally exists." He turned the page. "Authorized family representative for final arrangements, Naomi Vale." That was the break. No shouting, no gasps. Just the room turning away from Lenora's version all at once. 2 women from church looked straight at her. One deacon frowned openly. Mrs. Halpern sat back with the expression of someone who had been waiting for other people to catch up. Percy took a small step away from Lenora and never stepped back. Trent tried to recover it. "That's not the whole story." "No," I said. "It's the written part." Lenora made one last attempt. "Helen was fragile. She said different things to different people." That was when Celeste stood up. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. That's not true. Aunt Lenora told me the front row place had already been decided. She told me Naomi was too deep in grief to represent the family properly. She told me to sit there. Every face in the room turned toward her. Celeste kept going. And she was at Helen's house before she died. With Trent. Looking through files. Trent snapped. Celeste. But it was too late. You had a file box in your trunk, she said. I saw it. The room went very still. That was the social collapse. Lenora's authority had depended on looking composed, helpful, and central. The minute Celeste spoke, that image broke in front of witnesses who mattered. Pastor Rollins did not defend her. Percy moved farther away. The church women stopped pretending they were not listening. One of them whispered, not softly enough. She moved the daughter at the funeral? Yes, Mrs. Halpern said. Then the financial collapse arrived. Mr. Sloane walked in. He had not been invited by me. He came because Lenora had called his office earlier that day and mentioned a realtor by name while trying to move practical matters forward. His assistant had traced it immediately. He crossed the room, greeted me first, then addressed the table. For clarity, he said, no one here has authority to list, show, transfer, or negotiate any interest in Helen Vale's residence. Any attempt to do so will be voided and may create liability. Realtor. List. Transfer. That was the money underneath the grief, spoken aloud in church. Lenora lost color. Trent said, no one listed anything. But he sounded weak even to himself. Mr. Sloane placed a paper on the table. The agent named in this morning's inquiry has already been advised there is no authorized seller. That finished it. People no longer saw a family disagreement. They saw an attempted move on a dead woman's house before the family story had even cooled. Pastor Rollins stepped back from Lenora. One of the deacons said plainly, this is not grief. No one contradicted him. That was the emotional shift. Not mine, the room's. Lenora tried one last sentence. I was trying to keep this family from falling apart. Mrs. Halpern answered before anyone else could. No, she said. You were deciding which parts belonged to you. After that, no one sat near Lenora again. Celeste sat down crying quietly. Percy left through the side door. Trent did not stand beside his aunt. Even the church volunteers serving lunch began placing plates farther down the table, around her instead of to her. I picked up my coat, thanked Pastor Rollins for reading the documents, nodded once to Mr. Sloane, and walked toward the door. Lenora called my name behind me. I did not turn around. By then, the room had already answered for me. By the end of that week, no one argued with me anymore. That was the strangest part. Not the legal notices, not the calls, not even the silence that followed Lenora through church after the lunch. It was the sudden absence of persuasion. For days, everyone had tried to move me with urgency, guilt, family language, public optics, soft accusations, and procedural pressure. Then, once the documents had been read in front of witnesses and Mr. Sloane had blocked the house from any informal handling, all of it stopped. The structure had begun speaking louder than anyone in the family. Lenora did not call me again. She sent one message through Trent asking whether I would reconsider making this so formal. Mr. Sloane answered for me. Percy stayed out of it completely. Celeste sent a short note admitting she had let herself be used because it felt easier to follow someone certain than to question what looked polished in public. I did not answer that either. Some truths do not need a reply once they have already cost the right people something. The realtor inquiry vanished. The lock company produced the service record Mr. Sloane requested. The lock change had been scheduled by Lenora the morning before the funeral, paid with her own card, and described as a family access adjustment after loss. That phrase alone told the whole story. She had not acted out of panic. She had acted on schedule. The missing household binder turned up a few days later in Trent's garage. He did not deliver it himself. A courier did, after counsel demanded the return of any estate-related materials removed from the residence. Inside were utility records, tax statements, insurance renewals, and a yellow sticky note in Lenora's handwriting attached to the homeowner policy. Ask about vacant house coverage. List fast. Mr. Sloane had it preserved without comment. He did not need one. The note said everything that church lunch had already suggested. That was the financial ending of it. Not some dramatic bankruptcy. Something quieter and more realistic. The sale they had hoped to rush died before it ever existed. The house never entered a listing system. No quick transfer happened. No private consensus hardened into money. Their access to the asset collapsed because the timing they had counted on was gone. The social ending was quieter too, but cleaner. Pastor Rollins visited the house one afternoon with a paper sack of muffins from the bakery my mother liked, and an apology he tried not to dress up too much. He said he should have asked harder questions when the reading changed. I thanked him for reading the documents at the hall and left it there. Mrs. Halpern came by with seed catalogs that had still been arriving in my mother's name and sat with me at the kitchen table while we sorted mail into piles. Two women from church dropped off a casserole and, for the first time since the funeral, said directly what everyone had finally understood. Your mother knew who was taking care of her. No one said that in front of Lenora anymore. Trent came once, near dusk, when the trees in the yard were still bare and the porch light had started turning on before dinner. He stood outside with both hands in his coat pockets, like a man who had arrived too late to be angry and too early to be forgiven. I brought Mom's rosary, he said. It had been in the glove compartment of his car. I opened the door and took it from him. The beads were cool from the cold. I recognized the small worn silver near the cross, where my mother's thumb used to rest during waiting rooms and bad news. She asked for me when you weren't there one night, he said after a moment. I looked at him. It was about 2 weeks before the end. She thought I was you at first. His voice tightened. Then she realized I wasn't, and she just said, Tell Naomi not to let them hurry the house. There are sentences that arrive too late to repair anything, but still matter because they close the last false door. I nodded once. I know. He stood there another second, then said, Lenora told me we had to act fast or you'd freeze everything. Yes, I said. That was the point. He looked like he wanted to say more. Maybe about being weak. Maybe about following the easiest authority in the room because it spared him from becoming one himself. But he didn't. He just nodded and went back down the steps. That was enough. I did not need him broken. I needed him unable to pretend. A month later, I sat at my mother's dining table with Mr. Sloane and signed the initial estate administration papers. The process was not dramatic. It was orderly, which felt truer to her than any speech would have. The house would remain in the estate until all accounts cleared and distributions were properly handled. Her charitable gifts would go out exactly as written. Her personal effects would be inventoried room by room. Nothing rushed. Nothing simplified by the wrong hands. When Mr. Sloane left, the house was quiet again. I walked from room to room after that. Not as a daughter searching for proof anymore, but as the person my mother had actually prepared. In the den, I straightened the blanket over the arm of the sofa where I had slept during hospice. In the study, I put the recovered binder back into the drawer they had emptied. In the kitchen, I washed the teacup with the thin blue rim she always chose in the afternoon and set it back on the shelf. Nothing dramatic happened in those moments. That was why they mattered. The loss was still there. The chair at the table was still empty. Her coat still hung in the hall closet with a receipt in one pocket from the hardware store where she used to buy bulbs and command strips and birdseed. Grief had not become smaller just because the truth had won. But it had become cleaner. It no longer had their version mixed into it. In early spring, I stood in the front garden and planted the bulbs she had ordered before she got too tired to kneel. Mrs. Halpern came over with gloves on and helped me space them properly because, according to her, my mother always planted too close together and then blamed the catalog. We laughed once, softly, in the cold dirt. It was the first laugh in that yard since before the hospital. When the first green tips pushed through weeks later, the house no longer felt like something nearly taken. It felt like what it had always been. Not a prize. Not a bargaining chip. Not the fastest thing to sell before a daughter caught her breath. A record. Of work. Of caution. Of a woman who understood that love without structure gets stolen by the loudest person in the room. And of another woman who learned, maybe later than she should have, that being pushed out of the picture is not the same as being replaced. At my mother's funeral, they left my seat empty and gave it to someone else so the room would accept a false order. In the end, the seat meant something different than they intended. It was not proof that I had been removed. It was proof that they had to stage my absence because my place could not be taken any other way.